You may have heard that expression. It's enough to make a grown man cry. We think about men when they have grown and they become mature. Well, one of the marks of a mature man is to master their passions. And so they're not driven by every little feeling and emotion. They're stable and steady men, but yet men cry. There's some things that can just bring a mature, stable man to tears. And so we'll say, well, it's enough to make a grown man cry. But there's nothing wrong with men crying. Here, the text comes from Philippians 3:18 and 19. You might want to turn there. That's what we're going to be looking at. Here's where we find Paul weeping. He says, "For many walk, of whom I've told you often, and I'll tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is their shame, who mind earthly things." Now, Philippians is a joyful letter, isn't it? And yet, there's a part of weeping here. Men cry. We read that Jesus wept. We read in Matthew 4:4, "Blessed are they that mourn." Well, that would include the men that mourn. We read about David. "Give ear to my words, O Lord, hearken unto my meditation, consider my meditation, hearken unto the voice of my cry." So that the prayer of David is like he's crying out to God. So there are things that make men cry. In Philippians it says, "Rejoice in the Lord always," and again I say rejoice. You go through the book of Philippians and you find a reference to joy in that book 19 times. It's probably the most joyful, optimistic book in the New Testament. And yet, it's also in this book where we're going to find Paul weeping. And we want to ask, well, what is it that would make Paul cry? Well, remember what Paul is facing. Paul is in a Roman prison. And I'm sure the accommodations in that were not very delightful. So here he is imprisoned in Rome, but that's not what's making him cry. It tells us in Philippians 1 and verse 12, "I would that you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened to me have fallen out rather to the furtherance of the gospel." So he saw good even in the fact that he was in prison and what that was accomplishing. But it wasn't just that he was in prison. Paul is facing a trial that could result in his death. But that wasn't making him cry. It says in Philippians 1, 20 and 22, "Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what shall I choose? I want not, for I'm in a strait betwixt the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better." Not that he was in prison that was making him cry. Not that this prison and trial could lead him to his death. Well, that wasn't going to make him cry. There's something else going on here. There were those with Paul in prison that were proclaiming Christ in a way that would make it harder on Paul. They were not doing it out of sincerity. They were doing it out of contention and strife. But that wasn't making Paul cry. We read in Philippians 1, 15 through 18, "Some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds." The way they were talking about Christ and about the things that Paul said, they were doing in a way hoping this would make it harder on Paul. But yet, even though they were doing this in pretense, Paul said, "Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and do rejoice." So it wasn't the fact that people were saying things that were trying to make it hard on him. It was making him cry. Now, all these are the kind of things that you might think, so, well, that'd make me cry. To be in prison, to be facing a trial that could be my death, and to have folks outside talking about things in such a way, trying to make it harder on me. Woe is me, we might say. But not Paul. In spite of all of that, he was still rejoicing. And so it seems kind of unexpected that before he's through with this book, we do find him weeping. So what would it be that would make Paul cry? Well, it's the way some of his brethren were living. Now, as we read this and read it in context and read all that, it sounds like he's talking about some of his brethren here. And they ought to know better than this, but they were not living right. It says their God was their belly. There's a tale that is told that a lot of the commentators like to quote. It was in a play, and the playwright right now, I can't quite recall. You might not know his name if I called it anyway, but you might. But the Greeks like to go to their plays and performances, and this was just part of the literature and culture of their age, and part of that play was Cyclops. And Cyclops, you remember him, he's that big, almost like a beast kind of a man that had the big kind of a giant with a big one eye, old Cyclops. And one of the things, Cyclops was a very profane person in the Greek literature. And Cyclops is the one that said, "My God is my belly." He didn't worship anything. All Cyclops wanted to live for was the satisfaction of his flesh. And some have thought Paul may have been referring to this when he's talking about some of his brethren who are living like a Cyclops, as though their God is their belly. What that means is the essence they thought of life and what they thought was the most important thing in their life is just satisfying their own fleshly appetites. Some were living that way. It says here, whose glory is their shame. Have you ever met people like that? Well, I've known people that would brag about things they ought to be ashamed of. Why, they'll tell something on themselves, and I thought to myself, I wouldn't have even told that. And yet they're telling it like they're proud of it. How much liquor they could hold. Or how awful they have been in different things. Maybe how they was able to cheat, and boy, they were good at this. And those are the things you ought to be ashamed of. And they're taking glory in things of which they ought to be ashamed. Well, we see it. In fact, we see it in a way I never would have even imagined. Have you ever heard of Pride Day? Of all things, of which someone ought to be ashamed, and they're glorying in that. And then it says, they mind earthly things. How many times has Paul taught, and he did it in his preaching, set your heart on things above and not on the earth beneath. And yet here's where their mind is. Their mind is on things of this earth. And we read about Simon, the sorcerer. Remember how that when Peter came down and he was laying his hands on those in Samaria, and they were receiving the ability to perform miracles. Now Simon, see, that was his job. He was a sorcerer. He had made a lot of money out of making people think that he could do supernatural things. It's a real credit, isn't it? That when Simon the sorcerer saw what people were doing after Peter and John had laid hands on them, he knew, look, there's no way you can trick people with these things. These are genuine, real supernatural things they are doing, and not the kind of tricks I was pulling. Boy, Simon saw that and he thought, if I could do that, I could make a lot of money. His mind was on earthly things. And so Peter said, thy heart is not right in the sight of God. Thou art in the gall of bitterness and the bond of iniquity. And so that's thinking, minding earthly things, thinking always in terms of earthly things. Well, Paul's weeping over this. And the reason he's weeping over these is because he knows what's going to happen to them. Their end is destruction. Now, don't think that they're just going to be annihilated. That word destruction is used in the sense of ruin. And when it's talking about spiritual things, and it's talking about men, their end is destruction. They are going to spiritual, eternal ruin is what's going to happen to them. And here, they ought to know better than this. This is enough to make Paul cry. He goes on and says, for many walk, of whom I've told you often. In every epistle of Paul, you read what Paul said. He lays out the doctrine of Christ and the gospel of Christ and explains that to us. But before that epistle ends, he's down there telling us, now look, this ought to affect the way we live. And he gets very specific then on attitudes we ought to have toward life and how it is we're to conduct ourselves as Christians. And so he's told them many times, but yet many have ignored that. And they're walking like the Gentiles walk, that have no God in their life, whose God is their belly, and whose mind is on earthly things. And many are doing this. We call it worldliness. Worldliness in the church. It's not a new thing, and it's not an uncommon thing. But it's enough to make a grown man cry. He says he's crying, and part of the reason, put it in context here, the verse just previous, 18 and 19, verse 17. He's talking about examples. Brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk, so as ye have us for an example. Now you follow the example of Paul, and you see the honorable way he lived in many. And so, okay, we've got some good examples. It's right after this that he says that I tell you of some, I even tell you now weeping, that they walk as enemies of the cross. Well, part of the problem is they're bad examples. Others see that, and they think, well, we'll follow that. It says, no, mark those that are walking as we have walked. Let them be your examples. And I tell you about many that they don't need to be your example. If anything, they are bad examples. So it makes Paul cry. And then he says that they're enemies of the cross of Christ. How could someone be an enemy of the cross? You think about what Christ did on the cross. God so loved the world that he gave his Son. And Christ suffers and dies on the cross for our benefit. And how could you become an enemy of something like that? Well, these were not enemies of the cross because of the fact that the cross had empowered God to save them. You see, Christ becomes the propitiation for our sins by the things which he suffered. God is going to be just, and he's got to punish sin. It's because of the cross now that God can be gracious unto men, because there is a punishment that's suffered, but that's what's involved in that word propitiation. The price is paid, the wrath is appeased, and it kind of gives God permission, or it empowers God to be saving to men. Now, I bet they love that. People love to talk about grace and about God's grace toward them. It's found in Romans 3, 24 and 27. Being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in His blood, to declare His righteousness for the remission of sins that are past, through the forbearance of God, to declare, I say at this time, His righteousness, that He might be just and the justifier of them which believeth in Jesus. Now, were they enemies of that? Well, that's not what they're enemies of. They would rejoice in that. Well, God's grace, how could you be an enemy of that? That's not what makes them enemies of the cross. There's something else about the cross. Because Jesus died on that cross as an example. He's an example of love and of self-denial. And He says, be ye followers of me. And it's not the blessings of grace that make them enemies of the cross. There's obligations that come with grace. The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared unto all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world, who gave Himself for us that He might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto Himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. That's what the cross does. Well, we have hope in the cross and knowing that because Jesus died for us, we don't have to die. Not to God, He can save us. But that cross then also brings this responsibility and displays for us that obligation that we have in response to that cross. To live before God zealous of what is good and of good works and deny worldly lust. Now you're not doing that if your God is your belly. So that's why they become the enemies of all that which ought to be good. They're like those in Jude 4. There's certain men crept in unawares, who were before of old ordained unto this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of our God into lasciviousness. Anytime anyone tells you that because of grace, we don't really have to worry about doing what's right, and we don't have to worry about trying to do things the Bible way, or we don't have to be careful in that. Well, God's gracious. He's going to forgive you. Anytime anyone says that, they're turning the grace of God into lasciviousness. That's not why Christ went to the cross. So, Paul is weeping. Paul's not the only one that weeps over this. We read in Hebrews 13 and verse 17 about the elders of the church. And elders, when there's a church with elders, the main responsibility of those elders, it's not making sure that the checks get written right and go to the right things, although sometimes that seems like occupies a lot of attention. The main responsibilities of elders is looking after the souls under their keeping, as shepherds looking after the flock. And here they see those misbehaving. It causes them grief. Obey them that have rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give account, that they may do so with joy, not with grief, for that is unprofitable to you. Now, it's not the text, that's my notes, which says God Himself grieves. I should have probably put that out. But God Himself grieves when we don't live right. And the text for that is found in Ephesians 4, 17 through 31. It's really a long text. I only have part of it here, and I'm not going to read all of that, but it tells us, walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them. It goes on, their past feelings, giving themselves over to lasciviousness. Let no corruption proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good, to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace to the hearers, and grieve not the Holy Spirit of God. We've come to Christ, and we're in His church. And then turn around and live like the world? That causes God grief. And the Apostle Paul, so in tune with the heart of God, would see this, and it'd make Paul weep too. And so I tell you now, many walk enemies of the cross of Christ. Well, here's what I want to do. Let's flip that around. I don't find in the Bible the expression, the friends of the cross. But I know Jesus said, you are my friend if you do whatsoever I command you. And so instead of being enemies of the cross, well, let's live as friends of the cross. Let's live in such a way that we are those good examples where our God is not our belly, but we've got a God in heaven, a God to serve and a God to glorify. And let that be our God. And to mind spiritual things. And then we're in harmony with the cross. We'll be friends of the cross instead of enemies. And so with that, I extend the invitation. What a wonderful thing it is. We can be baptized into Christ and be saved by the grace of God. But let's be mindful of the great obligation that comes to live in keeping with that gospel and according to grace that'll bring our God the glory that is due His name and be His friends. And so with that, if you'd like to come forward and be baptized into Christ, and live that life, then do it as we stand and sing this song.